defined in a certain limited area.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, but like, you know, David Chalmers is the other one who came up with this metaphysical question about why is it we see red when we whack our thumb with a hammer? And nobody's been, and that's called the hard question. So the easy questions are, you know, why did I brush my teeth this morning? Or, you know, the mundane stuff. And he's saying, well, that question, why we associate red with pain, I think is because it's an atavistic trait. You know, just like being afraid of snakes and spiders. It's something that goes way deep in our physiology that is
Blood.
The superstructure of consciousness. That's why that happens. But, you know, you have to know cell physiology and all the other stuff, which is all the junk in my brain that I finally have had an opportunity to spew out thanks to some liberal publishers. But yeah. But not many people are listening, but
No,
that is
no, they never listen to what matters at the time. It's only later.
Yep, after you're dead. Oh well. Not that I'm looking forward to that, but
no, obviously. Well, you don't know. You might enjoy it, but
Is Andrew joining us?
he is coming. Hang on, I've just had a text message. Can't. Oh, hang on, I'll give him a ring. Hang on.
So Peter, I did read your book.
Oh, here he is. He's here.
Oh wow, good.
I kind of skimmed over the mathematics.
Yeah.
I stopped at calculus, so.
Well, it's not very difficult mathematics.
I understand.
Which book are you talking about? Foundations of Physical Law.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I know you've written more than one. Yes, Foundations. Yes.
Yeah, but it's not incredibly difficult. It's more like playing with counters than something incredibly intense.
Well, I really glommed onto the concept of the attractor and the concept of zero, because I'm of the opinion that a cell and an atom are basically the same. You know, it's all, a cell is zero.
It's the same. It's the same thing repeated at higher levels. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm trying to write this version of my theory of everything with a retired statistics professor from Temple University. And when I said to him, well, you know, even though Schrodinger's negative entropy idea is not zero, but to the rest of the world looking in, it is zero, because the rest of the world doesn't understand negative numbers. So it just interpolates it as zero instead of, you know, going through the complicated idea of the nil point. So yeah. So if in fact the atom and the cell are homologs, and they all so converge on the Big Bang, and I know you're not a fan of that, and I understand why, but at least for now it works for me. Well, so that vector is what, you know, is what we all ascribe to, if we are, you know, if we are to be able to continue on as a species, or not.
What I say about the Big Bang,
yeah,
it is a contentious theory, and I don't want other things that are more certain being dependent upon it.
I understand. No, I understood what you were saying perfectly well, and it is. But I guess for me, when I started to think about, you know, having watched you guys talk yesterday, the thing that I glommed onto was that, I mean, I stand on ceremony saying that everything I've ever said has been experimentally demonstrable, as is the redshift, which was the, as you know, I mean, is the basis for the Big Bang, which is empirically valid, right?
Oh, yeah.
Penzias and whoever got the Nobel for that, I guess that makes it valid.
I don't think anybody got the Nobel for redshift.
I thought
unless it was Hubble maybe.
Oh, okay.
Maybe it was Hubble.
Okay.
You might say you got it for that, but yeah.
So when you guys, I don't know if you, Mark, if you had some sort of an agenda, but I did want to follow up with the question you guys sort of left off on, which was
we just go with the flow.
What should we be thinking about? I think so. I spent 20 years having an ongoing conversation with an astrophysicist friend of mine whom I played squash with in Baltimore. He was the guy who determined who got the, you know, time on the Hubble Space Telescope. So he was really on top of his game. And so he taught me physics between 1968, when I took my last physics class, and late 1998, I guess it was, and beyond. Anyway, my point being that that kind of colored my, and at that point, around that time, they were trying to put a mass spec on the Hubble Space Telescope so they could image the cosmos. And Michael Schara would tell me that, like every instrument, there's a signature, and you got to reduce the signal to noise ratio, which we do in biology too. And that started me thinking about, is it plausible that biology can teach us something about physics? So where there are gaps in the physics, the biology as a sort of a bioassay could actually allow you to back into some interesting concepts in physics. So is that Looney Tunes, or is that?
It's not impossible. It's not impossible. I mean, there are. I think the nucleus in the cell was before the nucleus in the atom.
Is that true?
Yeah.
Is that true, Peter?
Yes. Nucleus in the
Very
cell is
interesting.
century. Nucleus in the atom's 20th. And I think the word comes from the cell.
Yeah.
Wow. Great. Love it.
And
Okay.
So the way that I backed into this whole evolutionary question as a cell physiologist was to apply what we had discovered back in the late 70s when I was still a PhD student, that in fact, the way that embryogenesis works, which wasn't known mechanistically up until that point, is through cellular communication through growth factors. So that became a whole cottage industry. There were like 15,000 peer-reviewed papers on the subject. But, and so what I did was I basically worked backwards. I deconstructed it, the evolution of the lung, which is my area of expertise, back to the unicellular state through these cellular signaling mechanisms. And then I superimposed that on phylogeny, that's speciation, and it works the same way. It's just the timescales are different. And when you put those two, merge those two, the ontogeny and the phylogeny, Haeckel phylogenetic law, you have evolution. But the point I wanted to make was that it was all predicated on the idea that emergent properties come out of the history of the organism, because in my laboratory over the last decade, we've been doing epigenetic research funded by the NIH to determine how cigarette smoke affects childhood asthma. And in that context, we use nicotine as a proxy for cigarette smoke, which has 3,000 components, and showed that if you treat a mother rat with nicotine, you see the asthma phenotype for at least 3 generations, if not more. We couldn't afford to go beyond that. And that was supportive of an observation by the epidemiologic group at USC that in fact, it wasn't whether your mother smoked or your father smoked, but whether your grandmother smoked. So that was a hint that there was some sort of transgenerational phenomenon going on. But the point I was trying to make was that and Gould and Verba published a paper in 1982 calling what I was talking about a pre-adaptive state. They called it exaptation. So it's a recognized phenomenon. And so the question became, well, okay, so now you're in the unicellular state. What was the antecedent of that? What was the prototype for the cell? And I've suggested that it was the singularity, because the cell, particularly the cytoskeleton, dictates the condition of every condition of the cell, whether it's homeostatic or mitotic or meiotic. And I've done work in my own laboratory showing that if you put like lung and bone cells into a microgravity environment, they become zombies. So the cells can no longer generate a calcium flow, they cannot reproduce, and therefore they've lost their biologic being. So clearly gravity is an important effector of the biologic system demonstrably. And that's why astronauts wear pressure suits, because the lung has a gradient from the top to the bottom, and you lose that in hyperspace. So you have to have pressure on the chest in order to sort of pseudo maintain that. And they also develop osteoporosis because the bone is plastic and it will lose calcium if it no longer has tension on it. So yeah, So that's how I get back to sort of fundamental principles of physics and the possibility that, in fact, the Big Bang is the poises both the inanimate and the animate alike. But that's just my way of sort of putting everything together in a way where I can at least begin to try and countenance what actually potentially may have occurred. But it's, you know, and again, it's all based, I mean, the experimental evidence is there, other than the leap from the unicell to the singularity, but that's kind of a, that's clearly inductive reasoning. I mean, to prove that is difficult, but that's what gets me back to what I was saying earlier about using the biology as a way to understand the physics. Could you use the unicell? And in fact, Sid Brenner, the Nobelist, in a discussion of these very ideas with Dennis Noble, the head of the International Union of Physiologists, Brenner actually concluded the same thing I did, in the sense that he was saying it's not top down or bottom up, it's middle out. But what Brenner has done is he's tried to exhaustively determine the guts of the cell, of a cell, which I think is it's like trying to take a pile of spaghetti and figure out where it begins and ends. You really need the dynamic interactions of the cell with its environment and with other cells to really begin to understand that. But my point is that, is it possible that you could do heavy duty physics on the unicellular state that might predict the Higgs boson, for example, or whatever?
Peter, can I ask, just to, I suppose there's one question here, which is whether zero and the Big Bang are in some way commensurable.
Well, yeah, I don't know really, because the Big Bang, everybody thinks it's one singularity, but it isn't. That's not the theory any longer. The theory of the Big Bang now is that it was an infinitely dense state and that it just exploded outwards to become less dense, but it wasn't from one point.
Right.
And you say, where did it start? Did it start in the center of our galaxy, or in the center of our cluster of galaxies, or in wherever? It started everywhere. That's the theory, I think. I don't completely understand the way they think, but I think that's what they're saying. And so your zero would have to be everywhere at once for it to be compatible with Big Bang. And the other thing is, they always start with something. They don't start with nothing. They say they start with nothing, but they don't.
Yeah.
Well said.
Yeah.
Because you have to have energy to start with, or something like that. You can't start with nothing at all. And
But what's totality at the beginning of, well, if there is a beginning, the totality is always totality, is it?
yeah, I say the totality is zero at any time, regardless. And that creation is now, because we create a new zero now. But they don't think of it that way. They see it as something splitting up, and they see energy splitting up into particles and things like that, and antiparticles. And they say, well, where did all the antiparticles go?
Yeah.
And that's what they say. Well, my argument about that is that the antiparticles are there all the time. They're there now. Because if you write down your Dirac wave function for a particle, you have two particles and two antiparticles with two spins. So where are those antiparticles? Well, what I say is that those antiparticles are the vacuum, the rest of the universe, if you like, that particle lives in.
So I've considered the possibility that what I glommed onto is the idea that if the Big Bang was this huge eruption, cataclysmic eruption, Newton's third law should apply. Third law of motion: every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And so I've considered the possibility that that's what homeostasis is, whether it's a balanced physical reaction, E equals mc squared, or a chemical reaction, or even a biological reaction. Although biology is a pseudo-physical principle. It's always attempting to get from Bohm's explicate to the implicate, which will never happen. So because we started in ambiguity, we're always in the process of trying to reinvent it, to adapt to an ever-changing environment. But in the context of what you were just saying, Peter, about particles in space, so if the whole enterprise of existence is the reconciliation of dualities, is it possible that the things that you cannot account for in the great scheme of things have not resolved their dualities yet, or never will?
Well, I don't think we will never actually, we can never get an exact dual of anything. And I think that's how nature operates. If you got a single particle, fermion, it'll look for a partner in the rest of the universe.
Okay.
Because that is its true partner, is everything else. And that's what would zero it. And it's looking for the thing that would zero. But all it can do is get something that looks a bit like itself, or like an antiparticle, and become a boson, and so on. And or become an atom, a hydrogen atom, or something like that. Another particle with some opposite character. It can never get its true opposite to zero. And I think that's how complexity arises, because everything is always trying to zero itself, and it can never quite do it.
Is this broken symmetry then? So if you're a biological organism and you're a molecule in a biological organism. Sorry, Peter?
Yes, same happens with biology.
Same thing. So, but are you then, you are tending towards trying to zero yourself,
yes,
but you never quite manage it. But at the point where you kind of never quite manage it, you then go up to a higher level of recursion in your attempt to zero yourself. That's
exactly.
it, isn't it?
Exactly.
So this is the birth ordering that you were talking about.
Yeah. And your this is what happened with cells, wasn't it? When they became when they got a nucleus, that was a merging of two things that didn't quite cancel each other out, into a bigger union.
Right.
Then each of them tries to connect with something else to cancel itself out, and then you get multicellular structures.
Well, but I think that the thing that has been lacking up until now, because of the lack of acceptance of Lamarckian inheritance, which we know is correct, we've shown it in my laboratory and others have as well, is that we think of phenotype as the sum total of the inventory of our characteristics. I don't think that's correct, because based upon epigenetic inheritance, which we and others have shown, what happens is that the organism acts as an agent. It's delegated to go wander around in the environment to detect any changes that are occurring, assimilates that information back in the organism within the gonads, sperm and egg, which we and others have shown. And in fact, and that alters the adaptive strategy of the offspring. So in other words, the offspring have a head start on the ever-changing environment, and it's not any old change. It has to be relevant to the trajectory, if you will, of the evolutionary trajectory of that particular organism. Then it becomes relevant, and then there's a mechanism within the gonads during meiosis that selects whether any given so-called epigenetic mark is relevant or not. And we're fun to discover that, but we haven't yet. We don't know what it is, but we know where it exists, and that it does exist, and it must exist. But so just quickly, what I've realized is that in my reduction of evolution, basically looking at cellular communication and signaling, those signals actually from one cell to another, they become high energy phosphate compounds, cyclic AMP and inositol phosphates, which then affect the growth and differentiation of the target cell, which then affects the next cell, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So basically it's a flow of energy. And I think that that flow of energy is emanating from the energy of the Big Bang, and then it just plays itself out. But what we think of as material evolution is really not correct. It's really energy. It's what Whitehead talks about in his process theory.
Please,
And then in fact, Excuse me?
Yeah. Could I ask a question, please?
Just to finish,
How much?
so it's just
Okay,
like
go
the
on.
Red Queen in Alice. So she's running as fast as she can to stay in place.
Yeah.
That's what the cell does. It's desperately trying to remain proximate to its origin, to remain faithful to the trajectory of that vectorial flow of energy from the origin, whatever you want to call it. I'm sorry, Andrew, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No. How much information can be stored in the gonads? Is all the creature goes through this tiny cell?
Yeah.
Is information about the animal stored anywhere else, or does it completely go through that little? I'm trying to think about things like termites and how they, where is the model of the termite mountain? Is it contained in the termite gonads?
Oh, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think, the beehives scenario I'm more familiar with, but, so the queen delegates her workers to go out and fly around and collect pollen, but they're also collecting epigenetic marks. And once the queen is satisfied that she's sated, she flies off and starts another hive. It's the same idea. So your question, so in terms of are there other places where that information that's in the germ cells, the egg and sperm, it's located in every cell of the body, but the only place where reduction division or meiosis occurs is in the gonads. And that's where that process of selection, and it actually probably relates to what Kurt Friston, the guy, the neurobiologist at the Wellcome Trust, has found, and that is that during rapid eye movement sleep, the brain cools in both us and in birds. So there is a similar kind of mechanism, probably an exaptation of the reproductive strategy, which occurs in the brain as well, in all likelihood. But I'm waving my hands here.
Hang on, you said something I thought was very beautiful. You said organisms assimilate their environment.
Yes.
A cell assimilates its environment.
Correct.
And
that's Lynn Margulis.
Okay.
Endosymbiosis theory.
How much can they assimilate before they run out of the ability to embody it? I mean, I'm thinking that DNA only 50 kilobytes, whatever it is, 50 megabytes of information. One always suspects it kind of wants more.
Cannot? You mean it reaches a limit?
Yeah.
Well,
because human culture is stored outside the body, isn't it?
Correct.
In libraries and in language. Is there anything comparable for the bee?
Culture? Sure. They're social organisms. Yes.
Yeah, but the bee still goes through, let me figure this right, it still goes through an egg, doesn't it?
Yeah, sure. Yes. Right.
But the culture continues. There's always a bee there which has culture. Is that correct? I think.
Yes, it's So what I had concluded from my reverse engineering process was that there are in fact first principles of physiology. So the ones I enumerated were negative entropy, which is Schrodinger's "what is life" idea.
Yeah, I got that.
Osmosis, which is basically ions lining up, positive and negative, just like in your car battery on either side of a semi-permeable membrane, and homeostasis. All you need are those three components, and everything in life refers back to that. That is the touchstone. That is the Magna Carta. That is the origin of life, and you must remain faithful to that in order to be able to. You have to know your history in order to know where you're going, right? Santayana. So yeah.
Okay.
But your question about whether you can overwhelm the system. So epigenetic marks are chemical derivatives of the DNA. It doesn't change the code. It just decorates it with either a methyl group or a ubiquitin group or a ribosyl group, which changes the readout. So whether that can be overwhelmed, probably.
Oh, God.
But I don't know, and that would constitute extinction.
But
right?
John,
So we don't. Go ahead.
So I was going to say, if it's very interesting that you should say that they don't change. They're effectively redundant. Then are they redundant bits of information? So they're amplifying things that are already there, but they're not really changing it. It's a bit like harmonizing a melody.
Correct. Right. So in our work on asthma, what we found was it was a specific receptor mechanism, an acetylcholine receptor, which regulates calcium. And in the upper airway of the lung, the amplification of the calcium flux causes the twitchiness of the smooth muscle in the airway, which so that if you have a cold air challenge or particulates, instead of a sort of a well-constrained system, you cough because the muscle is twitching. And interestingly, in the brain, the same thing happens, but it jazzes up the neurons and it increases short-term memory. So that's probably why smoking has been retained in human society, because there are these, it's called epistasis, there's balanced selection there, for example.
Oh. So smoking, as alleged, might help you concentrate, is what you're saying.
Oh, yes, absolutely. It's been shown to be the case. Yes. Right. And so dogs develop asthma too. And the mechanism is similar to what happens in humans. But the balancing selection there is, I'm sorry, those are host defense mechanisms that are homologous in the lung and in the skin. And in the skin, that wiggly gene that causes asthma in the airways determines coat color. So you have a reproductive strategy, camouflage, which is which supersedes.
Someone's just been arrested outside my house. The police are sitting on him. I'm just going to look. Okay, sorry. I don't want you to think I live in the crime centre of the UK. This will just take a minute. I'm just being curious, deeply interested in what you have to say.
All right.
Never a dull
so you have, so that's why dogs wheeze a little bit, but they can get their genes passed to the next generation because of the camouflage, the coat color phenomenon. And it's been shown in humans as well. The only study I know of so far is in China, but it shows the same skin abnormalities associated with asthma. It's called atopy. It's a rash, which in turn relates to the brain because the skin gave rise to the central nervous system. And you have all human neurodegenerative diseases has skin lesions, for example. So everything's interconnected.
Yeah.
But it all goes back to the units. So for example, I mean, again, I'm not being hubristic here. I just spent 50 years self-flagellating, trying to find a narrative. And I finally have found one, but my point being that, so this way of thinking explains why we go back to the unicellular state, which is dogma in conventional descriptive biology. It just goes around in a do loop instead of explaining the how and the why in terms of causation. So.
Can I'll ask about homeostasis? Because it seems to me that homeostasis, as the systems theory people understand it, and pretty much as how Schrödinger would have understood it, is very closely related to the nilpotent.
Okay. Yes, because
I'm Peter. I'm looking at Peter saying that because it seems to me that the nilpotent is a rather more powerful and sophisticated way of talking about homeostasis because it includes all the levels of recursion which are involved in the totality of making something homeostatic, I mean, in maintaining a homeostatic relationship.
And any system which conserves energy, or which you can describe any energy exchange if it doesn't completely conserve it, can be described by nilpotent. It can be described by the energy equation, and that energy equation can be always described by a nilpotent. And that nilpotent will take the energy, the system, one bracket for the system and one for the rest of the universe. It can always.
The energy formula is the Nernst equation? Which energy?
Well, I'm talking about Einstein's energy equation, E squared minus P squared. That one can always be used for any system that conserves energy. And if you can use that system, that equation, therefore you can always write it in form of a nilpotent of 2 square roots of 0, one of which represents the system and one of which represents nothing minus the system. That is everything else.
Yeah. Okay. So
you can always do that at any level if you've got a conservative system. And this sort of brings us, you mentioned Newton's third law. Why does Newton's third law work at every level? You know, why doesn't it stop working at some level? And it doesn't. There's always a system, and outside of that, there's everything else. And the whole system has a force on the rest of the universe, and the rest of the universe has a total force on the system. And you can always devise any system, conservative system, in that way. And if it is not conservative, then you can restructure it as though it were, you know, by adding an extra force to account for that.
I'm sorry, so the energy equation is which one?
Einstein's the energy equation. E squared, well, to write it properly, it's E squared equals P squared C squared plus M squared C to the fourth.
Okay.
This is the mass energy momentum equation.
Yeah. We normally, the thing is that isn't often used in classical physics. And the reason isn't that the mass is, they leave the mass out. And the reason isn't that the mass isn't important. It's because the mass is so important, it's so big that, you know, you don't notice changes in it. So that's why they leave it out.
You mean the P squared C squared is so small, it's insignificant?
Yeah, by comparison with the mass in classical systems. But it doesn't mean that it's not important.
Okay, right, it's still there. Right, okay, I got you.
It's tremendously important because it's so big. And any system that conserves energy can be represented in that way. And therefore, you can always take any system as an interaction with the rest of the universe, exactly as the particle does.
So your comment about homeostasis being valid at every scale. And similarly, the way I've deconstructed and reconstructed biology also is valid at every scale. And that's why I thought it might be of importance, because you don't have to make up new rules at different scales.
Yeah.
Because we know there has to be some common denominator, right? Just as, you know, Mendeleev's periodic table and atomic number. But Andrew, just to go back to your comment about culture. So one thing, I've glommed onto this idea that personally, shaving one day, I usually sort of get my best ideas when I put steel to my throat.
Yeah.
And I was thinking to myself, I'm looking at myself and I'm saying, okay, so you're 73 years old, but you don't feel 73, you feel 38.
Yeah.
Why is that? Okay, so I thought about that for a long time. And then I started querying my friends, and I found that it was fairly universal, other than people who've had, you know, chronic illness. I mean, that's a difference. I understand that. But there's this whole cottage industry on what's called subjective age. So
I'm 36, by the way, if you're curious.
Oh, okay, you're younger than I am. And you, Peter? How old are you?
How 65?
On average,
in kind of Earth years, you're asking.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it would, you know, when they've done a
planet you're on, but Earth, yeah.
So in a systematic study that was published, they said on average people feel about 20 years younger than their chronological age.
Yeah.
And then but the thing that struck me when I was reading through that literature was that it was the same. It was the obverse of what happens when you're a teenager and you want to get the old man's car keys and.
Oh sure, right, okay, yeah.
Right. Okay. So if you're interested, I can send you the paper. It's under review. So basically,
yes, please.
The underlying reason for that is because both the adrenal gland cortex and the testes and the ovaries are producing androgens, which affect our psyche, right? And that's what's driving this thing. But in late life, those things start to regress, right? You're pulling the androgens levels go down, and you have the loss of that drive, but it's replaced by the effect of oxytocin, which is a socializing hormone. And so basically in late life, we are less edgy, if you will, or aggressive, or whatever you want to call it. But the point is that so the co-author of the paper took me to task. He's a physician. He said, but John, that makes no sense because late life doesn't influence the reproductive strategy. However, of course it does. That's why I'm here in Philadelphia taking care of my grandchildren. Okay, so you have that larger cultural impact on the children and grandchildren that is conducive to the reproductive strategy. So in that sense, that's why culture and particularly why human society and culture are so important.
Mm.
And I developed a whole concept of how language is actually a tool. Because we stood up on two legs, we had ability to use our forelimbs to make tools. We had to communicate, so we developed oral tradition and then written tradition, which is the synthesis of the tool making and the language. And interestingly, in the brain, the area of Broca is where both of those things are housed. Okay,
Yeah.
so there is a
Okay.
structural homologue. Okay, but my point being that the written language is what's gotten us to this point in human history. But we need to appreciate, I think we need to appreciate that, because we don't tend to. We just take it for granted. And now with this pandemic, I think it's time to reflect and to really think hard about how are we going to restart? Somebody put, the virus pushed a pause button. We restart this whole thing. And we want to see it roll out. Because in my opinion, what Einstein said, if you keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect a different
Stupid,
result, it's insanity. And that's what we keep doing. We keep going through these sine waves. Some clever guy figures out a way to put things together in a way which is productive. Then the the Luddites come on board because they see the shiny stuff, they weigh it down and it collapses. We cannot afford to keep doing that for all the attendant reasons. So sorry to be preachy, but I really find it, an opportunity to do something productive.
Okay.
Can I ask about, because I've been, obviously, John, you and I have been talking about this, and particularly the oxytocin stuff, which I find absolutely fascinating. And I suppose there are two thoughts. Our thinking this idea is part of some sort of systemic process. At a total level, there must be some sort of systemic process going on, even to have thoughts about it. And the other thing is to say, is it as
You mean holism? You're talking about holism?
I guess so.
Okay, I don't mean to put words in your mouth. I just want to understand which.
Yeah, I think that's what. Well, I'm just thinking. It's you get onto slightly dodgy territory here, but there is something about, why is it that we start to become aware and then start to act on our awareness and our scientific curiosity and understanding.
So for me, it's why is it? I think there's a consensus that there's something greater than ourselves.
Yeah.
We usually think of it in terms of religion, but I think there's a biologic premise. And the other thought that I had 50 years ago was hiking in the mountains above Montreal, looking up and saying to my wife, why is it that there's never a bad color combination in nature? So those ideas are sort of antipodes of what I think you're talking about.
Yeah, but maybe it's nothing. It could be nothing. It could be zero in some way. If there's some sort of zero totality. But I mean, and at a more practical level, are we just saying that we need more oxytocin in the environment? And that would make everybody a lot kinder.
Yes. So I'm supposed to have a Zoom meeting with the preeminent oxytocin expert in the world.
Okay.
She's the former head of the Quincy Institute at Indiana University. She's married to another crazy Hungarian. I'm Hungarian. Who came up with this polyvagal theory of how the vagus actually determines the kinds of things you're talking about. But anyway, Sue Carter, so she was advocating for the use of, there was a letter to the editor where they were advocating for the use of oxytocin in COVID patients, saying that oxytocin is a neuroendocrine hormone that it integrates all of our physiology. And that I found fascinating because, so what they've determined, I don't know if you've followed this COVID thing in terms of the science, but the virus attaches itself to the angiotensin converting enzyme 2 in the lung. And it's now known that, so in the microvasculature, and that controls blood pressure within the capillaries in the alveoli, okay? Normally what happens is if you become hypoxic, like you're drowning, you're gasping for air. What happens in COVID patients is their oxygen levels drop and they don't react in a physiologically appropriate way, okay? There's a disconnect between the physiology and the reaction. And the same mechanism applies to the glomeruli and the kidneys, same thing, okay? I won't go into the details, but trust me, they are homologs. And so if you've got a disconnect of the lung and the kidney simultaneously with the rest of the systemic circulation, of course you're going to have these what are called cytokine storms, because the physiology has been totally subverted. So it makes sense to me that oxytocin would be a reasonable thing to try. They treat women in labor with oxytocin all the time to hasten labor. Okay, so there's a large clinical experience. You puts it in your nose, and maybe you get off the vent. So yeah. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hog the stage, but I'm going back to your question about whether there is a holistic way to think about this. Is that where
I think
you're going?
it's also whether there's a mathematical analog to this way of thinking, which I kind of suspect there might be.
Well, I keep asking you about the math because I'm
not the person. Peter's the person to talk about this, but
I don't know immediately of the mathematical description of this business about. Are we talking about this oxytocin?
Yeah.
No, I don't know immediately how to explain that in a mathematical way.
But I think the issue,
not oxytocin per se, but the only thing that I've been able to come up with that scientifically is relevant to the way I think about evolution at the cellular molecular level is the periodic table. The idea that you have a common denominator through these cell signaling mechanisms, and that you could theoretically express the idea in mathematical terms. I think about, if you had a Turing what do you call it, automaton with a brain that remembers, that's what I'm talking about. And we do have the math for the Turing automaton. So the memory comes, the memory comes from the fact, in my opinion, that life began as lipids floating in water. They form these, spontaneously form these micelles. And the catch is that when the sun warmed these structures, they deformed, they liquefy, and then at night, when they cool, they reform. And in the process, they capture calcium in the water. And that calcium accretion can be toxic unless you're a micelle that figured out how to form a calcium channel. And that was the origin of memory and everything else in life. Okay, so my point being that I think, contrary to popular belief that DNA is memory, it's not. That came after the fact. There's lots of DNA in the environment. The origins of memory are in that hysteretic property of these primitive protocells. So mathematically, the question is, how do you express the modification of the automaton? And I keep thinking in electronics, there's, I guess it's a transistor, so a mechanism by which energy is flowing, and in that it servos itself so that there's a gating mechanism to control the flow of the electrical activity. That's essentially what I'm thinking about as an analog to the way that the Turing automaton is moving out in its environment, and it's bumping into things, and it's learning, and it's accumulating knowledge in order to be able to remain mobile, locomotive.
But what's driving it? What's the driving force, do you think?
The Big Bang. I think
Okay,
the energy from the energy of the universe is funneling through the biologic system as a mimicking of the physical stuff.
Okay.
So, Harold Marvitz, the biochemist, said, an atom of hydrogen with a proton and an electron they're in homeostatic balance. And it's the same thing that happens in a cell. So there are, and I've laid claim to the idea that there are quantum mechanical homologs between a cell and an atom, in the sense that, for example, Pauli exclusion principle has 4 variables. Those 4 variables, the first 3 are deterministic. The 4th is based on time and is probabilistic. The cell does the same thing. It's got 3 principles, fewer principles, but they are both deterministic and probabilistic. That's why we exist in this
Sorry, how does
no man's
the
land
Pauli exclusion principle find an analogy in a cell?
in the sense that it's both deterministic and probabilistic in that sense.
Okay.
The Pauli exclusion principle is completely nilpotent.
Hmm.
Explains why there's a Pauli exclusion principle,
Yes.
because no two can be the same.
Right.
Well, that's
Well,
what
I agree. I think biology is nilpotent too.
Yeah.
We're always attempting to come back to zero, to the unicell,
Yeah.
because that is the state of being. That is the primary. So when you think of the life cycle, we think of it as adults, you know, copulating. Okay, copulating. and then it all.
Is that how they do it?
So I'm told. You know, and so Darwin talked about random mutation. That makes no sense to a biologist. It's like you're on some sort of a social dating network and you're trying to get laid. You're a weird dude. You've got, you know, one ear, or, you know, you're cross-eyed because you have this mutation, and it's monoallelic. It's not, you know, and you don't find a partner that has the same, you know, bent.
No, he didn't talk about mutation. He talked about variation, which is different.
Yeah, well,
Slight.
the modern, okay. So the modern synthesis
is a later concept.
Yes. Okay. I'm sorry. Forgive me. I agree with you. I understand what you're saying. But that's the general gestalt. It's all random mutation, but it can't.
Well, variation. It is random variation, because that's what you're saying about, you know, the
Sure.
ballistic thing. That's variation.
But
So,
I think it's internal selection. So as a physiologist, as an endocrinologist, I know that if you create stress on the organism, it generates these radical oxygen species because of the basically friction, if you will. That's the way the cell copes. And those radical oxygen species can cause gene mutations and duplications. So we know that there were 3 major gene duplications in the water to land transition about 500 million years ago. And all 3 of them are receptors, genes for receptors. And those receptors are essential for adaptation to land. So there's sort of that's proof of principle that you had that transition, and everything leading up to it, you know, provided the wherewithal to then adapt to land.
So
What you're saying, it kind of looked ahead?
Yeah, because it's exaptations. It knows that there are, you know, it has that memory, and it dips into its memory. So, for example, so we have fossil evidence that this happened because of Tiktaalik, the thing that Neil Shubin discovered, published in 2005, the fossil evidence of a quadruped. We have that, but nobody ever thinks about what happened to the internal workings of that fish, that the bony fish that evolved into a quadruped. And that's what I'm trying to explain. So for example, I think that the primary selection pressure was for the skeleton, because you have greater gravitational force on land than in water because of buoyancy. We know that the bone, for example, is plastic. That's Wolff's law. So if you put pressure on bone, it will deform and reform in order to relieve that pressure. Yeah. That's dictated by a molecule called parathyroid hormone-related protein, which I was funded for 30 years to study by the NIH. And it is a mechanotransducer. And so picture the organism is being selected for that is most capable, most robust in that mechanism of adapting its skeleton. So the way I got funded by the NIH was that they did a deletion or a knockout experiment for the gene at the Mass General, and the technician notices that the animals that are deficient in this molecule, PTHRP, they die shortly after birth of a lung disease. So they're gasping for air, they can't breathe. They don't form alveoli. So that was critical in order to transition from the swim bladder of these bony fish to the lung of a mammalian, and every step in between, from amphibian to reptile and mammal bird. Okay. The same mechanism holds true in the gut, in the kidney. So the glomerulus is actually operating on the same principles as the alveolus does, and the skin, so the skin barrier, the brain, and many other organs are dependent upon that scenario.
When I said, you know, what drives it, and you said the Big Bang, do you think that, you know, that, and Peter said that the nilpotent the nilpotent thing is kind of are we talking about the same thing? Are we talking about, on the one hand, a historical event, but on the other hand, a sort of mathematical property which gives it a sort of dynamism in the same way that your historical event is doing? I think that's.
I think that.
I suspect they're the same thing.
Yeah. No, especially when you said that it's non-scalar. That's the key, I think, and that, you know, what we call homeostasis is common to both properties in a general sense. I think you have all the pieces of the puzzle, and they all fit together for the same reason. So I've burned through now 4 mathematicians who've not been able to come up with a mathematical model over the last decade or so. The last one was a very talented physicist who had his own startup company. He was Iranian, and when Trump came to power, he went underground. So we were almost there. We were at that, you know, the Turing automaton and the brain thing, and he was going to come up with the mathematics, and he was gone. So, no, but I mean, in my mind, there has to be a mathematical solution we're talking about.
It's not there now.
What was he saying about the mathematics of the automaton?
He wasn't. He was just saying that as part of what he was saying. Wasn't the whole of.
Who was the guy?
Some Iranian. He sort of went on the ground when Trump came into power.
As did many others. You know, there's a very large Parsi community in LA. I think they're all willing to put upon.
Okay, could I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Okay, John, 2. Firstly, don't spend more than 30 seconds on this. Do you believe it's possible the gene might have a cosmic origin, as some have suggested?
Well, nucleotides are prevalent in the cosmos.
Sure.
You know, they're ubiquitous. But as I was saying, I think that the nucleotide answer. So what you see is a common motif in which you have an adaptive strategy, sort of an ad hoc kind of, you know, string and tissue paper and glue kind of approach to a problem in the environment by the biologic organism. It then becomes constitutive through. So, you know, it's called the Baldwin effect, but it basically think of natural selection. Okay, but you have to have the first step is you've got to come up with a solution to the problem, which is non-genetic per se. It's epigenetic. So Waddington, you know, that Waddington invented that term.
Yes.
Yeah. So anything that is not the code itself is epigenetic. And historically, the reason that cell biology is totally absent from the entire evolution literature, because the evolutionists, you know, Haeckel and Spemann couldn't come up with the goods, so they went with, you know, Mendel's theory because it was a facile way to keep things moving. But there's other than the stuff I've published, which I cannot publish in the evolution literature, the conventional evolution literature, the editors tell me I'm an idiot. I don't understand science.
So
go away. But there's no cell biology at all.
Right.
Okay.
So where would I read about epigenetic things in an interesting way? What would you recommend I look at?
So I've published over 100 papers on the topic.
Okay, well, maybe I'm going to look at that now.
So I can send you some of my propaganda.
Yes, please. Sorry, next question.
So what's your email address? Please.
I will. That will arrive shortly. Okay. We'll do that.
Okay. Sorry, I just didn't want to forget to ask that.
Well, sorry, we're talking about evolutionary things. Man had many competitors at the hominid stage, including Neanderthals. What difference? Is it just chance that we have survived and they haven't? What difference did we have that has made us continue and them to? I assume we killed them. Do you not think?
So I guess when I start thinking about your question in my parlance, so we came out of the Rift Valley and we either went north or we went east, right? as a species.
Go on, yeah.
Okay, and in the process of going north, we lost more and more melanin from our skin, is my assumption. And there's a whole history, so the skin evolution is important in adaptation to the latitude that we ended up on, whether we ended up in Spain or, in Sweden and everything in between. And skin is a very important organ. It's probably the most important organ of the body, but it's highly undervalued because.
Okay, I understand that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so the big breakthrough in the evolution of the central nervous system was Nick Holland at UC San Diego saying, well, because they couldn't figure out how to bridge the gap between worms and organisms with a backbone. So worms have their central nervous system in their skin. And as I said earlier, so the skin actually is the homologue of the central nervous system. But my point is that when you ask about Neanderthals, they probably developed a different adaptive strategy than our forebears. And, they got, either we ate them or the bugs or they didn't have the immune system that we do, or, some combination of things. I mean, it's a great question. And I think it's still, there's a lot of Neanderthal research that's going on. But they're not going to look at what I talk about in terms of epigenetics. It's going to be purely genetically based. And then the trick is to back calculate why any given genetic glitch may have been caused by epigenetic properties. So for example, I'll give you an example. There's a well-known, highly talented molecular geneticist, evolutionist named Joe Thornton, who's now at the University of Chicago. So Joe publishes a paper describing how the mineralocorticoid receptor, which regulates sodium and potassium balance, evolved into the glucocorticoid receptor that regulates carbohydrate metabolism. And he shows that in the catalytic site of the mineralocorticoid receptor, there were 3 sides that were added to that site, which caused the mineralocorticoid receptor to become a glucocorticoid receptor. But he never tries to explain why or how that happened, just that it did.
Yeah.
Because if he did try to venture into the how and why, he couldn't get published in the conventional evolution literature because that's not Darwinian. It's how I think. And when I think about, and that process of the evolution of the glucocorticoid receptor from the mineralocorticoid receptor occurred during the water to land transition. That's well documented. So when I think about that, I think, okay, so now you have greater pressure on the organism on land, increasing blood pressure, causing these radical oxygen species to occur in the microcirculation in specific organs, because they're the ones that are being taxed, if you will, by the conditions. And that was what gave rise to this restructuring of the mineralocorticoid receptor, because first of all, it alleviated the effect of mineralocorticoids, which increased blood pressure, shunted it off to glucocorticoids, glucocorticoid receptors, the glucocorticoids, cortisol was already there, and that in turn stimulates the beta adrenergic receptors in the lung that allow for the separate regulation of blood pressure in the lung versus the systemic blood pressure, which was critical for air breathing. Okay, so I'm showing this string of events which we know occurred, but I'm showing it in context. Yeah. I'm an old English major. I think of context all the time. Okay.
Okay.
So that's the way I would explain it, and that's the way I have explained it. Does that help?
So an animal that went back to, say, from land to sea, like a whale, would be accompanied by very substantial genetic changes. Am I reading you right there?
Epigenetic changes.
Sorry, epigenetic changes. It would have to change its physiology very considerably.
But he remembered what it was like to be on land. I shot a question, I think, Mark, I sent it to you. I said, do butterflies have caterpillar dreams? I was trying to get at this.
Yeah, go on.
It turns out that there's experimental evidence that that's true. So the experiment was, oh yeah, they showed, there's an experiment in which so caterpillars smell a certain, I don't remember it was some aromatic substance that caterpillars have a penchant for smelling, for what it's gustatory, something like that. Every time the caterpillar was exposed to this aromatic, they would shock.
Okay, I'm with you. And I'd like to see that paper. But when you turn, Okay, please, when you turn a caterpillar into a butterfly, you put it through a blender. It goes down to cells. Am I not right?
Yeah, somebody
So,
said they liquefied. But yeah,
that's right.
yeah, they turn into mush.
It reconstitutes from cells up. So whatever that memory is must be contained, if I'm right, within a
Yes.
cell.
Correct.
How can
Yes.
that happen?
Every cell of that caterpillar remembers.
Or
Just
where
happens
is
to
it
be-
stored? It's not in the DNA, evidently. It's somewhere else.
Well, it's epigenetic. It's in their it's in their DNA in the sense that they remember. Yeah. But there's this epigenetic phenomenon because it
Hang
couldn't
on.
become part of.
Sorry, deep interest in this. Do bees know about flowers? Is that knowledge embodied in DNA or is it embodied somewhere else in the cellular structure of a bee?
I think it's both.
Hmm.
I mean, the DNA is dictating the cellular architecture of the bee.
Okay, in that case, you're saying that the flower's shape and memory is contained in the DNA.
Yep. Yes. Well, and I mean, we know that bees see in the infrared range
Yeah.
in terms of light. So it's probably, they're seeing the infrared of the flower, and that's what the cueing mechanism is.
But bees are very intelligent. You can train them.
Yeah.
They can recognize human faces and stuff like that. You've seen that one. That's just wild.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
And they
So,
do
I'm sorry,
this.
Going back to the caterpillar scenario. So in my mind, I'm fine with the caterpillar goes to mush, but the memory's still there.
Mm.
That's what, and so the experiment was that then the experimental group was butterflies were exposed to this smell.
Yeah. And they responded.
Oh yeah, differently from the controls.
That's great. I love that.
As if they were zapped, with an electrical probe, right? Okay, I'm going to send you the link to that paper. Once I have your email.
I'm wondering about homeostasis because the way I always found it very frustrating when systems people talked about homeostasis and they were talking about a temporal regulatory process. So it's a bit like your thermostat in the house, sometimes it gets too hot, the thermostat turns off, sometimes it gets too cold, thermostat turns on, and so on. But it's always this temporal process of switching on and off and regulating a temperature. Now, what was never accounted for was time. And
that's why I can't remember off the top of my head. Somebody changed the term to homeoresis, which does account for time.
Yeah.
Well, change in homeostasis over time.
Yeah.
It's called homeoresis.
I
didn't want to get into that.
No. I think
you're right.
I think Piaget mentions that as well. But
Piaget, the psychologist.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's something like that, I think. But I think in Peter's equations, time is absolutely embedded in the whole thing. And that seems incredibly important to me. It just that we see time as not a variable, but a different dimension or a different. I don't know, what would you call it, Peter?
Parameter.
Yeah. Okay. Parameter.
So time is only relevant in materialistic biology in the way I just earlier described the energy flow and the fact that it's constantly going back to zero says time is immaterial in the process. It's more Feynman-Einstein kind of, the Einstein debate with Bergson about whether time was relevant. And Bergson went to the mat for physiology, having to have time in the equation. But so this guy Etienne Roux, the French physiologist, published a paper in 2014 saying that it is illogical to define physiology based upon describing function. That's teleological and tautological. And I agree with that. But the problem is, well, what are you going to revert to? What is the alternative? I think I've provided that. But, the classic physiologists don't really understand cell biology. So screw them. But no, you're right. But I would maintain that time is really an artifact. It's an epiphenomenon.
Yeah.
I think it's
Okay.
important.
But there
It
is
goes back to,
in epigenesis,
Yeah.
it seems that you've got a homeostatic mechanism, whatever, but it's operating almost not for the individual organism, but potentially for the species.
yeah. So the individual is called allostasis. So it's the sum total of homeostasis, and for the species, yeah, it's still allostasis. Or, oh, I don't know. I don't know that there's a term for for the whole social system, but there is, but it's embedded in, yeah, it's one of a piece. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
But again, I mean, it's really hard for people to, I mean, it was hard for me to assimilate that idea because we're so wed to this idea of the life cycle and, birth, life,
Yes, that's right.
death kind of thing, that to think that that's really mythology is kind of hard to countenance. And yet, so for example, so my daughter is chronically ill and she was at the Mass General for yet another bowel surgery for Crohn's disease, and I'm twiddling my brain and I started thinking to myself, well, what happened? I write with a guy who wrote the book on the evolution of the microbiome. What happens to your microbiome when you die, if you're buried in the ground? Turns out there's a whole cottage industry on what's called the necrobiome. So our microbiome goes back into the soil, back into the aquifer, back into plants that are eaten by animals. And that could potentially be maybe not modern human practice, because we're buried in in things that don't degrade and we don't go back to the soil, but our ancestors did. And so is this potentially, so it turns out that the microbiome from the mother is in the uterus, so the child is being exposed to that microbiome throughout pregnancy, and then as it goes down the birth canal, it gets a big bolus of this stuff. My point being that there is a construct called the microbiome that is a tangible material thing. Nobody knows where the paternal contribution comes from yet, but they'll figure that out. And when I should punctuate all that by saying, I mean, we're as much as 90% bacteria. So the question is, what are we? Are we eukaryotes or prokaryotes?
We are an environment. We are our own environment for these other animals.
Yes, that's right.
Yes, correct. Right. Yeah, so, Claude Bernard called it the milieu intérieur. He didn't call it the environment, but he had the gist of it, right?
Right.
Yeah, right.
So they could be seen as parasitic, well, symbiotic, but it's in a permanent cycle.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Are we in communication with these things?
Well, yeah, so I gave a lecture at the Royal Society about 3 years ago, and the guy who preceded me was a pathologist in London who cites this experiment where they took these two strains of mice, one which was hyperactive and the other was very placid and, sort of whatever, which they use in the pharmaceutical industry for testing pharmacologic agents. They took the feces from the two animals and they switched them. And almost instantaneously, they switched their persona. So you tell me. I mean, we're not mice, but I do think that the microbiome of our gut has a huge effect on our disposition, on our behavior.
And we are, in terms of parasites, are very influential in evolutionary terms, aren't they?
The bacteria.
We're in some kind of communication with these closely, with things with which we live so closely. That is true, is it not?
Yeah, years ago when I was at the faculty at University of Maryland, there was a very talented microbiologist, and he was studying this disease of preterm newborns where their gut basically disintegrates, and showing that it was the bacterial flora of the gut, which was different in preterm infants versus term infants. But what they were showing was that the bacteria will bind to the epithelial cells in the gut and will signal. So yeah, I mean, I haven't followed that literature, but absolutely. And I was saying that, and Wells actually told us this back, at the turn of whenever we wrote War of the Worlds, because basically the bacteria saved us from the Martians because they need us.
Yeah.
We are
Oh,
desperate.
they were motivated. It wasn't just an accident.
Oh yeah, absolutely. No.
Very good. I like that. That's a good one. Yeah.
Peter, I'm just aware that you said you didn't have that much time today. Are you okay?
Yeah, just about. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm trying to get a sandwich down quickly.
Go for it.
Bacteria and all.
I wonder if we should maybe, I don't know. I mean, do we want to continue this now, or go away and think and then come back later in the week or something like that?
Go away and think.
All right.
Okay, we can go. I have a lot of questions, but maybe maybe they can wait. But I would very much like to receive some stuff, John. If you can,
Yeah.
I've sent you a little email. I'm not sure I've sent it the right place. We'll get in touch.
Yeah.
We'll sort
Okay.
that.
Okay, yeah, I'll send you stuff.
I
have 3 of my books in proof form, or 4 of them. So there's one called Evolution: The Logic of Biology, which probably is the most intelligible, if any are. But yeah, sure, it would be my honor.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. And if you have any feedback, so I actually went to an exhibit of Moshe Safdie's work in LA years ago.
Oh, really?
And I tried to get in touch with him because he's saying in his philosophy that he wants to make architecture organic. And I'm saying to him, well, yeah, but we no longer should think of Vitruvian man. That's not the right paradigm, in my opinion. Okay?
Keep going. Yeah, go on. Yeah. What is the paradigm?
The paradigm is what I'm talking about. It's the organic nature of life is the environment is us kind of thing. And how you can actually create design. So how do I put this? You familiar with this guy? His name is not Matthew Brady. Yeah, I can't go there. There's this crazy guy who did this whole thing about the muscle that suspends the testes, and they withdraw or not, depending upon the tension on it. So he overtook the entire Guggenheim Museum. So all of a sudden, the Guggenheim that I grew up with in New York City becomes organic because it's relevant to society now. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, that you could actually design buildings that are more organic, and are allowed to change over the course of a day or a week or a season or a lifetime in conjunction with the people within it, kind of thing.
Okay.
I mean, we're doing it already in a sense, right? But I think we're still wed to the old Vitruvian man, the Roman port, North and South Gate, East and West Gate, bilateral symmetry. That's all material biology. Energy-based biology is very different, right?
Yes, that is happening in energy flows in building are now becoming a consideration.
My premise was that if the buildings are more conducive to the physiology of the people within them, they would become more productive and more comfortable, right?
More like clothes.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Okay. Or food.
How very interesting.
Anyway. Okay.
Thank you.
So when's a good time to meet again?
Thursdays are
later this week.
Yeah. I think we should do it this week, otherwise we'll forget it.
No.
I'll forget it.
No, Mark, count me in. Anytime.
All right. Okay. You said Thursday again.
I said Thursday. Yeah.
Thursday. All right. Well, I'll see if I can do Thursday.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, it's great.
Any words of wisdom to leave us with, to think about? I mean, I tried to sort of, string this along through, Andrew asking what should we be thinking
nothing.
About? Really
it's about zero.
Nothing.
It's about how things add up to nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's like, do you guys get Jerry Seinfeld?
Yeah.
The Seinfeld show, it's all about nothing. But it was something, right?
Yeah.
It's like that.
What
We described ourselves as the zero men a couple of weeks ago.
Well, the Japanese did, you know, they lost the war, but they were zero men too. They, kamikaze pilots.
Yeah. Well, I hope we're not that.
We don't want to go there.
Not the nowhere men.
Nowhere, man.
Oh, there you go. There's that too. Well, thank you. Thanks for hosting this.
It's great. It's well, I mean, actually, it's the technology in a way. It allows this kind of thing to happen. And
Yeah.
That and viruses.
yes, exactly.
Mm. Thank you, COVID.
Yeah.
Well, but it is quite ironic how the virus has affected us. And I'm of the opinion that basically, maybe I said it earlier, that, you know, if you know Bohm's stuff on the explicate and implicate orders, basically the explicate order has collapsed. And all we have potentially is the implicate, but we can't get there. So instead we surmise what it is and what we could be if we, once we push the play button again. That's what I'm interested in.
I think
that's.
I think there's an interesting discussion about Bohm there, and I know that. I mean, I've talked a bit about Bohm with Peter. Some people at AMPA have talked about Bohm. I think Andrew and I have talked a little bit about him, but maybe there's an interesting discussion about where that work stands now and where the implicate and explicate is so fascinating.
Well, I think it lends itself to experimentation because, in my opinion, things like near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, Abraham Maslow's peak experiences, the runner's high, all of those things, meditation, they all actually are manifestations of the explicate. But we know that they can collapse, and what you experience is the implicate, or what, as close as we can get to what the implicate is. So that's where I find it interesting, because it actually lends itself to hypothesis testing.
I'd like to explore that more, actually. Maybe that's one for Thursday.
Okay, yeah.
All right.
Yeah, and I'll be, okay.
Okay.
Super.
Well, we'll see you then.
Oh, so Thursday, actually, I'm supposed to talk with Sue Carter at 3:00 on a Zoom. So Friday for me?
Yeah, Friday. We're fairly flexible, so I don't know about the other. Well, we'll sort something out.
Friday's a bit tight if
Okay.
you make it this late.
Okay.
Saturday?
It's a bit tight Friday
Okay.
because there isn't. Well, no, maybe Friday isn't. No, Friday's okay. It's Sunday that's tight.
All right.
So I don't know about you guys, but we realized that it's actually just today and yesterday and tomorrow.
Yeah.
The days of the week really are not relevant anymore.
Yeah.
It can't tell whether it's Sunday or any other day.
No. Every day is Christmas.
Zoom meetings. Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Anyway, great to see you.
This has
And
been fun.
we'll see you later in the week. Okay.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Stay well. Wash your hands.
Recording. How do I exit this? Full stop recording.
Leave meeting.